they will do is, well, first of all, I should back up. They really don't celebrate Pentecost too much, believe it or not. I talked to a couple Jewish friends at work, and I wished them a good Shavuot, and they said, well, we don't celebrate that. And I said, oh, but that's one of the required feasts, isn't it, for the Jews?
Yeah.
There's a Passover and the Feast of Tabernacles, and they said yes, but they don't celebrate it, and it's kind of a forgotten, if you will, feast, unfortunately for the Jew.
Right. Well, and the hard thing for the Jews in these feasts is that, the 3 annual feasts that they would go up to the temple in Jerusalem. Well, obviously there's no temple in Jerusalem. So ever since the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD and then again in 120, once the temple was destroyed, then the feast kind of lost their significance. And modern Jews do not understand the things that we're talking about. I mean, there's some that do. And I think many of the ones that are beginning to understand the significance of the feast are the Messianic Jews. Those who have accepted Christ have, through Christ, are beginning to look back at the Old Testament feast through new eyes, beginning to see all this dynamic beauty that they didn't see before. So yeah, my quest to learn about these things, one of the first things I did as a younger person is I tried to find Jewish people, and I went to a synagogue to talk to Jewish rabbis, and I found out they don't have a clue. They have no idea. And you think, well, they're Jews, and this is Bible, Old Testament's a Jewish book. Certainly they would know. They know they don't know. Of course, they've been through a long, dark age, haven't they? Since the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, they've been in a long, dark age, and they don't understand these things. So anyway.
The other thing that it seems that they've moved towards, and I think it's tradition and more speculation, that somehow they connect the giving of the law on Sinai with Pentecost. And for those who do celebrate it, that it's a reenactment of the giving of the law. So they focus on the law on Pentecost is what I gather for those who do celebrate it.
Yeah, and if they would only listen to Jeremiah, right? The idea of writing the law in our hearts and our minds, see, that is Pentecost. That is receiving the Spirit, right? The Spirit is not just some energy that comes and gets us all emotionally excited. No, it's actually the retranscribing of God's law on our hearts and our minds, on our equipment, our restoration, because He just brought us out of Egypt, and we were serving Pharaoh there. So we were with the law. The standard of rightness, or the standard of the king, was what that was written on the slaves. That's why they have the gold earrings in their ear, right? And they're worshiping the golden calf because they came out of Egypt. They're slaves, and so God at Pentecost is trying to rewrite His law in their equipment. And they were supposed to take the slave things out of their ear and get away from wearing jewelry and get on to having God writing His law in their equipment. So if the Jews were actually studying the Bible and understanding the giving of the law at Pentecost, it would be a life-transforming thing. But they're just like Jeremiah says, we're wearing boxes on our foreheads and things on our hands with the law, rather than having the law actually written on our equipment, on our hearts and our minds. But yeah, so
Cynthia?
Question: why would the Jews celebrate the Pentecost if Pentecost was when the Holy Spirit came, and wasn't that when He revealed His Spirit, Jesus' Spirit? They don't believe in Jesus as the Messiah. So why would they celebrate Pentecost?
Because they live in an agricultural society, and actually what they would do is they would bring their first fruits. They'd bring it in a basket, and they would bring it to the priest. And they
Zechariah 5.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Pastor.
No, I just mentioned Zechariah 5. Keep going.
And they would recite. I have it marked down here, but they would recite something about their allegiance to God. That's right. It was a real ritual. So it really had to do with their looking for favor from God, because they needed the crops, they needed the rain, they needed to make sure that they wouldn't get pillaged by the Philistines or anything like that. So they were looking for his intervention and his grace.
So what do they do about
The
Jesus?
answer to your question, Cynthia, is that we call it Pentecost and we look at Acts 2, but it gets its name Penta because it's 50 days. Penta means 50, right?
Okay,
So
right.
Pentecost was celebrated for thousands of years before Acts 2. Jesus, what happens in Acts 2 takes the feast and gives it new light for
Okay.
Christians.
Got
But
it.
Jews have been celebrating Pentecost for thousands of years, right? Or
Okay.
supposed to be celebrating it. Yeah, that's why. That's the confusion.
Yeah, I was, but I'm not anymore. Confused.
Good.
Wow.
So, see, this is the same idea of us, right? I mean, we keep the Sabbath every week, right?
Mhm.
And so what happens is, like, they have been keeping Pentecost for thousands of years. Well, they go through the motions. Yeah, we're keeping Pentecost. Oh, just like we say, well, yeah, we're keeping the Sabbath. Oh, really? So Sabbath is worshiping your Creator, which means that you're being recreated into His image, right? So that, he's literally writing His law on your equipment. So your heart and your mind is being transformed by encountering the presence of God. That's keeping the Sabbath. So I don't care, you say, well, I don't do this on that day, and I don't do this on that day, and I don't do this on that. Oh, yeah, okay. But did you encounter God, and did you allow Him to rewrite His law in your equipment? If that didn't happen, you didn't keep the Sabbath.
Right.
I don't care what you did or didn't do. It doesn't matter, because you're still the same person you were. See, so this is what happens with religious people is they go through the ritual, but they don't have the life transforming experience. And so this is what God is. I mean, that's why they didn't go up the mountain at Sinai, right? They just told Moses, you go up and talk to God. Whatever He tells you, we'll do it, because we just need to do the do's and don't the don'ts, and then we'll be okay. But that's not what God is looking for. That's not what God desires intimacy with us. And so this intimacy is a life transforming thing. And so the feast became rituals, just kind of like we do our own rituals, but it loses its essence. And that's where what happens in Acts 2 brings the essence back to what it was supposed to be. See, at Sinai, if they had gone up the mountain and encountered God, instead of 12 tribes fighting with each other, going into the promised land, God would have sent them all over the world, like He sent the 12 apostles to be messengers of His kingdom that's going to go out to the world. I mean, that's what He desired, right? To save the world. And they would have been His messengers, just like the apostles were at Pentecost. After Pentecost, you see them giving the gift. He gives them the gift of languages, and they know where to go to do their evangelism by the language that they're given. So they go all over the world to spread the gospel of this King. That's what should have happened at Sinai. But God has to make a playground tent sanctuary and bring them in and play in the dirt and give them these kiddie things, because they're children. They stay children. Anyway.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I get it.
So how was your study about the birth imagery? Did you find some, Jeff?
Well, maybe this leads into the birth imagery. So we had talked about in the past that this is the festival that a king becomes coronated.
You're talking about the Feast of Tabernacles now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Right?
Just making sure we made the switch for people's mind.
We did. Yeah, thank you. And so I'm not quite sure. Two questions. One is this only an event that happened once a year? So like when there's going to be a new king, you would set the date for that coronation for the Feast of Tabernacles, and then that's the time it happened. And then when during this period did it actually take place? So clearly not on the Day of Atonement. And then there is a period of what, 7 or 8 days, 5 days. And then they went into the tabernacles, right? And then the feast ended up.
Right.
So where did the coronation come in?
Well, see, this is what's interesting, is that you have there are times, and the Bible isn't very specific about a lot of this information, in case you haven't noticed when you try to dig to find it out. It tells you about the coronation of the king, but it doesn't tell you the exact day that they're coronated. Now, the other thing is that the coronation itself, when the old king died and there was a new king, there was a process of a coronation, but it took time for the message to go across to the kingdom that the old king was dead and that the new king had taken his place. And so sometimes there's a gap in there. So whether they waited for a specific time for that to happen, which sometimes they did, like the book of Esther, right? They cast a Purim, and then they decided that it was only going to be a certain time of the year that the decree goes forth, right? Whether that happens with a set time that they have to wait for that day to come, or whether it happens by surprise and the king shows up at the pillar, Boaz at the temple, and he's anointed as king, and it's a surprise to the people, and they hear the decree. It happened in history. It happens different ways at different times, so it's hard to say. If they had the luxury of planning ahead, like for example, when David makes Solomon king, well, I think, and I don't have any biblical information for this, but I think that Adonijah tried to set himself up as king on the day of the king, and that forced the issue. So David then set Solomon up, and that happens on the day of the king, the Feast of Tabernacles, because that's what Adonijah was trying to do. Remember, he's having his feast when he hears the trumpets blow, and then he hears, oh, what's the noise? Oh, you're a good man. What's the good news? Oh, that's not good news, bud. Because there's another marriage feast, and David has made Solomon king, and all of a sudden his world falls apart. But see, so the point is, the ancients are very connected to the seasons and these specific days, and we're going to get into it tonight. But this is what this study of the birth really shines a lot of light. Okay, I mentioned Esther already. The book of Esther starts with what's it start with? You guys know the book, right? What happens?
They have a big party, and he's got all these princesses from around the country, and
Okay,
7 days later, they're all pretty drunk, and he asked his beautiful
okay, wait,
bride,
slow down, Jeff. Yes. Okay, so first of all, it's not a party. It's a feast of dedication. It's a feast. Only this time, the king, you notice, you read Esther, it talks about King Ahasuerus, and he's sitting on his throne in the palace at Shushan, right? And then all of a sudden, it says in the 3rd year of his reign, he sets this feast. And this feast, he calls everybody together, and all his princes and all the people, and he has a feast, and it lasts 180 days, right? So this feast is the feast of celebrating his kingship. This is what he's doing, only he expands it from a small festival to a half a year. 180 days is almost half a year, right? Then of course it goes into the story after that feast is over. Then he has another 7-day feast specifically for the people who live in the palace at Shushan, the 7 days. So it's very interesting, that 7-day period, he applies just to Shushan, which is his capital, his Jerusalem, okay? So specifically Shushan then becomes his bride, is the idea. And of course, in that feast, then he asks Vashti to come and present her beauty before these people, right? Of course, Vashti has lost her mind for some reason and thinks whatever. So, but this is how the book of Esther opens, right? It opens with the feast to the king. Now, this is important because what happens at the end of the book of Esther?
Well, Mordecai is made second in command. I know that.
Right, and how does it happen?
They give him a horse. They basically suit him up, and he goes.
Okay, you're right, Jim. But let's go back further. What happens? What does Esther do that causes?
He discovers the plot that they were going to kill the king.
It's another feast that Ahasuerus holds for Esther
No. You're right, but switch it around. Who holds the feast for who?
It
Queen
was Esther who
Esther
held the feast for the king.
Right.
That's right. So see, Esther's wise. Remember, she gets dressed in her royal garb, what Vashti would not do, and she goes in, and it may cost her life, but she goes in before the king, right? And what happens is the king extends his scepter, which means she has life. She doesn't die. Actually, she dies and is resurrected according to the ancient mind. Vashti just dies because there's no resurrection. She rejected the king. But Esther, she bows, she's death, resurrection, and then so the king is impressed. His queen has now put her life on the line for this request. And what is her request? Well, I'm putting a banquet on for you and Haman. Please come to my banquet. So this is a banquet for the king and for Haman, right? And then the king and Haman go to the banquet, and then the king says, okay, so you did all this wonderful stuff for me, so what's your request? And I'll give it to you. And what's her request?
She wants more. She wants Haman and his sons, his whole family.
No. What her request is that she's going to put on another banquet. And she wants the king to come again, and then she'll tell the king her request the next day. Why is she doing that? What's she doing? She's using the mind. She has the ancient mindset of this festival for the king. And when we go back to Exodus, you're going to see this. But in the festival for the king, what happens is those who are loyal to the king are exalted, and those who are rebellious to the king are going to die. Okay? But Esther is wrestling in prayer, and she hasn't got the answer yet. So she continues the banquet, and then she'll know. And so what happens? You'll notice it's after the first banquet that Haman goes out, and he's all excited because he thinks, "Hey, I got what I wanted, and I'm going to be the one that's exalted, and da 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 da." So then he sees Mordecai, and he's all upset, and so he comes home and he's all in blue because. And what's his wife said? Well, what's wrong with you? Well, the king and Esther want to make me this important person, but Mordecai. Well, then she says, "Oh, build these gallows, right? Because then we'll hang Mordecai." Well, then who ends up hanging on the gallows, right?
Mhm.
So the point is that Esther. So this festival to the king is critical to the book of Esther. By the way, remember I told you. Esther's experience and Joseph's experience in Egypt mirrors Daniel's experience in Babylon. The three are the same, right? So you're going to see this festival to the king is critical in all three of these stories. Are you with me?
Yes.
So understanding this symbolism is really critical because you'll notice it's after the second banquet that she asks again Ahasuerus for her life. And King says, well, that's a crazy request. Obviously, who in the world is going to kill you? And then she said, Haman. And so then everything's exposed. And so now at the end of the story, Jim is correct. Now Haman his head is going to be exalted. Yep, he's going to be hung. And then Mordecai, which is via Esther, is also going to be exalted, and he's going to become the representation of the king, the second in command, just like Daniel. Right? Just like Esther. So the story of Esther and the story of Daniel, the story of Joseph, all center around this idea, this concept of God's people become captives and become slaves, and it looks like they're going to be destroyed, but God exalts them so that they actually they run the kingdom.
But also in that
Amazing.
Correct me, but he also, since he already put the rule out to go, he gives the Jews an opportunity to defend themselves.
Right. And what does Mordecai do to defend himself? He rewrites the law.
Oh.
See, the law can't be done away with. So he rewrites the law.
He wrote to destroy, yeah.
That's that's just what we talked about, right? The rewriting of the law. This is the inscription of God's law, and God's law overrides man's law. So that what Haman tries to do to destroy God's people, God overrides by rewriting his law in his people's equipment, and they're delivered.
Right. Which brings back to even what Nebuchadnezzar did.
Yes.
That's why that came right to my mind about
Yes, that brings you back to Daniel 12, right? There's this decree to kill God's people, but God is going to have his own king who's going to rewrite this law, and this law is God's people are going to be delivered. Anyway, yeah. So, do you see the picture?
Mhm.
Let's go back one. We jumped to Esther. Go back to Genesis 40. Yes, Jeff.
Well, I just appreciate that the study in that, so often we hear that Esther was a oops book. It's just thrown in there. Don't know why it's there. No real scriptural context.
Yeah.
But to see the overview and the picture and to tie it in with the other scripture and the concept of what's happening, suddenly it's just a beautiful standalone book that ties everything together.
Oh yeah, and the details are so beautiful.
While you were going through this Esther story, it sounded like you put Vashti in kind of a lesser light than most people tend to put her in. She tends to be elevated as somebody who stood up to the king.
Yeah, I know. And most people look at Vashti as some type of victim, like she's being asked to do something ridiculous. I remember when the Sabbath rule lesson came out, they're just all this foolishness about how Vashti was mistreated by the king. That's just not true. That's not what's going on there. Notice, see in Persia, remember from Daniel, the ram is Persia, and the ram is pro-God, it's pro-temple, it's pro-sanctuary. So you'll notice that everything that Ahasuerus does is by the sevens in the beginning of the book. He's a servant of God. It's Haman is trying to deceive him, but he's a servant of God, and Haman is trying to get the lamb to speak like a dragon. So Ahasuerus is not some evil guy being mean to women. That's just a bunch of foolishness. That's the modern day perspective of that. That's just stupid.
But it says he was drunk, right, at the beginning?
No. He says he drank with all. They were drinking according to the laws of the Medes and Persians. That everyone was drinking according to what their own will, their own choice, right? So the point here is that the banquet of the king is a feast for all the people, because just like Daniel 4, the tree, everybody gets nourishment from the king. But the point here is that he's displaying Vashti and her beauty as a demonstration of the beauty of his kingdom. It's the same thing God's going to do with us, by the way. The bride, God is going to display his beautiful bride to show the glory of his kingdom. But that's what the New Jerusalem coming down is. So what Ahasuerus was asking Vashti to do is the same thing God is going to be asking us to do, to display the glory of his kingdom. And she's not interested in glorifying her king. She's not playing the game. Well, okay, well, whatever, it's fine. Then you're not the queen, right? So, God doesn't force us to play. We don't want to reflect his glory. We don't have to.
Mhm.
So, yeah, the thing with Vashti is you'll notice Esther does everything that Vashti refuses to do, because Esther reflects the beauty of the king. That's the role. That's all of our roles, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the wife is supposed to reflect the beauty of her husband. The whole idea of taking the name and at the marriage and all this other stuff. Well, we live in a modern, women's rights world, so we don't. Oh, yeah, okay, right. It's all of our role to receive the law of God in our equipment and to reflect the glory, the character of God. We were created in the image and likeness of God. So what is happening on the day of exalting the king is the same thing happens to all of us. All of us are to surrender to the king and to reflect his glory. God isn't asking anything of women that he's not asking of men. It's all the same thing. But anyway.
So when he was taking the kingdom away from Vashti, it was because it was because of reflection of good rather than what he was expecting.
Right. So the thing with Vashti is that the king doesn't take it away from her. She refuses it.
Right.
So he's responding to the situation based on the choices that she has made.
Oh, that's right.
And
then the king, let there go to. Yeah. Okay. Gotcha.
Right. And then notice he turns to the people that are writing the law. What's according to the law? See, the king is doing everything based on the law. That's the way the king is supposed to rule. He's not just making some emotional, irrational decision. I'm going to be mad at this woman because she won't do what I say. That's just not what's going on here, right?
Okay. Queen Esther sounds like she was Eve.
That's right. That's right. Only she was the right Eve. Vashti was the wrong Eve.
Right. But she did the thing in terms of,
That's right.
took the head, if you will, of the family versus, Eve did the same thing.
That's right. So yeah, Esther's willing to become nothing so that the king will become everything. That's what Vashti should have done. That's what we're called to do. Become nothing so the king will become everything.
I never heard that before.
No, I know, because see what happens is that we read the book of Esther through this 20th century, 21st century women's lived business, and all guys are evil and women have to be right. So all of a sudden Esther opens and this mean king is trying to make this victim queen do some terrible dumb thing. That's just a bunch of foolishness.